Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you a brief overview of my outlining process and what I do to prep for writing a story. Now, as I tidy up my desk here, I thought I'd just take a moment to kind of talk about my history behind outlining. I haven't always been an outliner. In the beginning, I often just kind of went by the seat of my pants, pantsing as they call it nowadays, and that worked for a while. And it got to the point where I wanted to write faster. I wanted to write more. And the best way to do that was to know ahead of time what I wanted to write. And so I started looking at different outlining methods, and I actually use a few different methods altogether in my outlining process. And I'm going to cover a few of those today. And if there's anything you want to see more in detail, just drop me a comment below and I can focus an entire video on that process at a later date. And with that said, let's get started. Okay, so my first foray into outlining was the Snowflake Method, and it was very detailed, very in-depth, and it was very, very overwhelming. But shortly after finding the Snowflake Method, I came across the 3-act structure. And what I like about the 3-act structure is it's very classical, I guess is the best way to put it. You can find it anywhere. You can take any movie you watch, any book you've read, and you can apply that structure to it. I actually got to see the author Alexandria Sokoloff speak early on in my writing career, just as I was getting started, and her book, Screenwriting Tips for Authors, was a huge foundation when I was just starting to outline and learn how to plot ahead of time. And I love that in that book she takes famous movies like Harry Potter and Star Wars, and I think there is some Stephen King movies in there too, and stories, and she applies the structure down to the time codes in the movie, saying, at this time frame you see this happen. And then she encourages you to go and take your favorite movies or other movies that you've watched to apply the structure to it. As I said at the beginning, the 3-act structure is very simple and easy to break down. You have 3 acts, and Act 2 you actually split into 2. So technically there's 4, but we just call it 3. And at the end of Act 1, you have the Act 1 climax. At the end of Act 2, you have the Act 2 climax. And then the climax of Act 3 actually happens shortly after the beginning or towards the middle of Act 3, because then you want to have some room for the ending and the wrap up. So in Act 1, you have the beginning, which is where your main characters start. It's their status quo. It's how their normal life is before the inciting incident, which is what spurs the action going into your story. Then there is the second thoughts, which is exactly how it sounds. The characters are having second thoughts about going off on this adventure. Then you have the climax, which is kind of like into a new world. Then in Act 2 is where all the meat of the story happens. It's where you have your obstacles, you have your midpoint, which is a big twist of some sort. And then in the second part of Act 2, you have your final obstacle, and then you have your disaster and your crisis, which is the darkest point in the story. Everything's gone absolutely wrong. Your character has lost all hope and does not know how to pull it all together. Act 3 is where your main character pulls it all together. They make the final plan, they storm the castle, and then you start working on the wrap up and the ending. So just to summarize, we've got Act 1, which is the setup of the story. Then we have Act 2, which is the confrontation, the big to-do, the body of the story. And then you have Act 3, which is the resolution. And this simple structure is what gets me through all of my planning. I try to make sure that my story, from the beginning all the way up to the climax, that there is a rise in action and tension, and then there is the resolution at the end. Now, using that structure, I then move to my plotting notebook. Now, this is a special made notebook I had done in Japan, and I'll link the store below. It's a really neat store where you can go, and they speak English there just a little bit to help you get through, and they have instructions in English, but you get to pick out your binding, your covers, how it closes, whether or not you have a pin loop, the paper on the inside, whether or not you want dividers and all that. And it was just such a cool store that I knew when I went there I wanted to create a notebook just for my plotting. The first type of paper I have in my notebook is just a grid paper. It's very light on the lines. I usually only use pencil, so that way I can easily erase what I need to. And what I've done on this first page is just set up that 3-act structure in a grid format. So each one of those boxes is what I call a sequence. I think Alexandria Sokolov calls them sequences too. So there's Act 1 has sequence 1 and sequence 2. Act 2 has sequence 3 to sequence 6. And just using that, I start filling out my story. And on the back of the pages, I sometimes do notes. And that little plastic card right there is called a pencil board. It kind of helps you put it under a paper so that way a pen or whatnot doesn't bleed through. I also have some blank paper in the middle, another pencil board, and then this one's really hard to see, but it's actually just lined paper for other notes. I thought that would be a good idea when I made it. Oh, that is super hard to see. I'm sorry about that. But when I return, I will probably go and have one just made with just that grid paper in the beginning. So that is my plotting notebook. Usually I don't pull this out until after I have gotten a story completely plotted, but I do sometimes carry it with me as I'm trying to figure out more details and fill in missing scenes that I just haven't figured out quite yet. Now, with all that said and done, the first thing I do when I go to start a new story is I like to write a summary. And this doesn't have to be clean. It doesn't really follow any sort of format. I just like to write maybe 3 paragraphs to a page. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. And it's just me kind of free thinking, free writing some ideas I have for the story. Usually it involves an opening scene and a few other scenes here or there that I already have kind of in my head, and it's just a very clear, he said this, she said that, very, very telling. It's not in a lot of detail. It's just any little bit that sticks out to me right now that I can think of the story. And this part can take me anywhere from an afternoon or even weeks at a time if I'm working on another story and I'm just kind of working on this on the side or in preparation for a later date, or say like NaNoWriMo in November. I like to have everything plotted and ready to go for November. So sometimes you know, sometimes it takes longer, sometimes the story's right there and I'm just have a ton of ideas to get down, and sometimes it is a little like pulling teeth. This story that I have writing here is the third book of my Legacy series, Wrath of the Gods, and I have a few other details, but since I'm only halfway through the second book of this series, trying to plot the third is very difficult for me. But I'm giving it a go here. And like I said, I do have an opening scene, and that's what I'm writing here. Okay, so after I have that summary is when I start working on individual scenes. As you can see here, I've just put some washi tape on my desk. I love washi tape. It works for so many different things. But when I go to start figuring out scenes, I will either put washi tape on my desk, I will draw this out on a sheet of paper. I do have a bulletin board that I will use sometimes and do sticky notes or index cards. It just depends on how I'm feeling, where I'm at, what I'm doing, as to where I end up drawing this grid and starting to fill it out. Sometimes I do it in that plotting notebook so I can carry it with me. Sometimes I'll even just start it, like I'll start it here, but then I will move everything to a different platform just to kind of help jar some of the ideas and get things moving. So what I do on each of these like post-its or index cards, I will write scenes as they come to me for all those different plot points. The opening scene, the inciting incident, all the different obstacles, the midpoint, the climax of Act 1 or the climax of Act 2. So usually the opening scene is one of the first scenes that will come to me where I know where I want to start the book. After that, I usually know the darkest moment and I kind of work out the end from there. So I have the beginning, I know where the character is starting out, and then I have bits and pieces to the end, and then I just kind of start working on filling in the pieces, trying to get the character from point A, that opening scene, all the way through to the end. And I just fill it in saying, okay, well, if this happens from, if this is the darkest moment, what happens leading up to that darkest moment? What put him in that despair, that distress? But yeah, and that's where it is. It's a huge puzzle, and you just kind of have to jigsaw it and make things work. Now with my outlines, they're never set in stone, so I completely understand that going into a story that I have outlined that outline is never 100% that is what's going to happen. I'm still very much a discovery writer sometimes when I am halfway through the draft and something is just not clicking, the outline doesn't feel right, or my characters have taken a complete left turn and gone off the roadmap. I usually have to stop, take a few deep breaths, and go through this process again. And I actually just did this for the second book, where I had an outline and something just wasn't feeling right. And so I stopped for about a week and I've been working on the outline, and I came to realize that while I had thought I was coming up to the darkest moment and the climax of Act 2, I was actually way back at the midpoint. And so I've had to replot it and figure out what happened in the rest of the book and kind of rearrange things. And that has helped tremendously. And I've been able to get back on track on drafting that and getting it up to my Wattpad fans. So after I've got most of these stickies figured out and placed on my board, that is when I transfer over to my computer and start writing in Scrivener. Okay, now I have to apologize because I totally thought you'd be able to see more over my shoulder like this, but not so much. Anyway, at this point in the outlining process, I open up a new Scrivener file, and here I'm just choosing like a blank Scrivener file, and I rename it, and that is pretty much it once you get it open. And I'm actually on a MacBook here, so it is the Mac version of Scrivener, and I am in dark mode. That's why everything is darker screen. I tend to like the dark mode because it doesn't hurt my eyes as much when I am staring at it for hours a day. Now, the first thing I do once I get into my new Scrivener doc is I make a bunch of new untitled documents and new folders. And how I set it up to start with is a folder for each act, and then each sequence has its own folder as well. And I just name them like sequence 1 or S1. And then that way I can transfer all those little sticky notes into their own Scrivener documents in the right folder. Now, what I love about using Scrivener at this point in the plotting stage is that if something changes, I can easily rearrange and move different scenes around. I can also make it easy to label certain scenes as one point of view and another as another point of view, because I do often write in multiple points of view, and so that is very helpful. I also really like how Scrivener tracks your progress with the project tracker, not just your word count overall on the entire draft, but your word count progress for each session or each day, and then also how you can still click into an individual document and see the word count just for that document. And you can also set word count goals for each document as well as word count goals for each day or each session. So Scrivener is definitely one of those things that I am so glad I invested in. The program can seem so overwhelming at first, but you can easily buy it, open a blank document, and get started writing right away and kind of learn as you go, which is kind of how I did it. And I would just Google or watch YouTube videos when I would get stuck or I needed to figure out something different to do, like how to export or I think they call it compile. Show you how well I know Scrivener right now. But yeah, so Scrivener has definitely been one of my favorite tools to use writing so far. I started on Windows Scrivener, and then when I got my MacBook, I bought the Mac version, and I actually have to say I really like the Mac version better. It definitely has a few more features and cleaner lines. But yeah, but it is definitely a great investment. Now, after I get the Scrivener file all set up, that's usually when I go into each individual scene and I will start outlining scenes. And that is very much just like at the beginning where I was doing a summary of the whole book. I would just do a quick summary of the whole scene. And that's, usually a quick setting detail, what happens in that scene, the purpose of that scene. And that can run anywhere between, doing it all right there for the whole book for each scene. And then sometimes I will just outline those scenes as I get to writing it. And that's pretty much it. Like I said, sometimes I go back and re-plot as I need to, But otherwise, that is my system for outlining a book. So I hope this was helpful. Please leave me a comment down below and let me know if you guys outline and what methods of outlining do you use if you do outline. Also, Sarah's HB90 Bootcamp is kicking off again next week. If you want to learn how to make the most of your time and set some realistic goals, check out my affiliate link below, and I hope to see you in the course next week. Peace, love, and happy writing, y'all.